Good morning. And it's a lovely morning in New York City. Thank goodness all's quiet out there and it seems to be not so hot and humid. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing on YouTube lately. I am going live on YouTube every Thursday at 12:30. And you're welcome to ask me questions and write in the comments section and ask me what you would like to see or hear. Right now, I'm answering some young people's questions. They're millennials, and they want to know, how do we get to where we are today in America? And they don't mean that in, how what's happening in our lives. No, they want to know what happened to labor and the rule of law. What happened to people who see two different realities and hear two different realities? Actually, they see one reality, but they hear two different realities. And it all happened by crafting laws that would work for we the people, and then making sure that those laws disappeared from our history. And I'll explain, and I'll do it over the course of probably several months as we go back in time to the ascendant of labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 1935, he codified the right to organize, the right to have unions, the right of labor not to have any interference in those unions whatsoever, and to be able to have a secret ballot with literally no corporate interference. 1935, the National Labor Relations Board, an act, came into existence, protecting labor and giving them the right to sue the corporation for wages, theft of wages, and for better working conditions. In FDR's mind, this was fair and just. That law lasted only about 12 years. 1947, even with Truman's veto, the Taft-Hartley law came into effect. 2 Republicans passed that law, and that made it so that the federal government became the arbiter of last resort in the cases involving unions. It also introduced the right to work laws in all the states. It's not magic that labor and unions were crushed over the course of decades until we are where we are now, where we see late-stage capitalism, where the greed of corporations has become so much a part of their DNA that they're literally going to cannibalize each other, and they're causing the inflation that will make it impossible for normal people to purchase. Sure, the wealthy, they don't care. It is a small fraction of their spending for food, clothing, technology, and gas. But it's not a small fraction of we the people's spending ability. Before the pandemic, we didn't have $400 in the bank. After the pandemic, I'm sure everyone has much less. That For the Families Act that wanted to be passed last year certainly needs to be passed this year. The good thing is people are aware. People know that they have no rights. They just want to know, how did we get here? It's explainable when you look at our laws and what we've overturned. Every time labor pops its head up and wants equality, the corporate powers that be smash it down. For labor, it's always, how low can you go? That's why I exited my business in 2013. I was told that I didn't have to make more than 10% profit. I couldn't exist on a 10% profit. When I was told how much my people would have to make, they couldn't do it either. They lost about 57% of their pay. They went back to 1970 pricing. And speaking of 1970s, even though labor was constantly being crushed by the law, labor didn't feel it, because in the 1950s we were still expanding. 1960s we were still expanding and thriving. Unions were thriving in spite of the laws that were put in place and the right to work laws. People were making a decent living after World War II. 1971, there was a man, Lewis Powell, who eventually was nominated to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, who said, labor is a scourge on our society. It is interfering with free commerce. There's nothing and nobody more heinous to labor than Ralph Nader. And he absolutely despised the fact that corporations did not have the power that he felt corporations were entitled to. And that was the beginning of worshiping Milton Friedman, which brought us to the 2008 recession and the beginning of so much else. This is really a progression of laws and people over decades, starting in 1947, where the rule of law was used against we the people, and where corporations were deemed to be the most important entity. There was nothing more important than free trade. And according to Powell and Powell's memo, or memorandum, or doctrine, this became the established conservative wisdom. However, Powell was equally fearful of the extreme left and the heel of the extreme right. He never meant that the movement that he espoused should become autocratic. And that's what we're seeing today, a little bit of the far right and the extremism. That's what's happened in our world. That's how we got to the insurrection of 1/6/21. No mystery. Kept overturning our laws, favoring the corporate welfare, favoring that over all other entities, and having many, many narratives, including lies. Those lies were not allowed to exist before. We had something called the Fairness Doctrine. It came into being also in 1947, I believe it was, and it came into being by the FCC, and it was overturned in 1987, and it was overturned and all references to the original fairness doctrine have been obliterated from the overturned policy of the FCC, which allows propaganda and misinformation to coexist. That couldn't happen before. When I was growing up with Walter Cronkite, you got the news. You didn't get the news according to Walter Cronkite. You got the news. You made your own decision on whether you thought it affected your life or it didn't affect your life. Not anymore. Every single channel that broadcasts news had to have the opposing point of view, had to have people debating both sides of the issue in a fair and balanced way. That doesn't happen today. That's why we have the culture wars. It's not a mystery. You allow disinformation, you allow misinformation, you broadcast a major event that affects the very democracy that we live under and our Constitution, the insurrection of 1621, and it's not on Fox at all. I know I tuned in and they had some kids in a competition. That was what was competing during prime time last night, when everyone should be viewing what's happened. Because not only did Trump instigate the insurrection, he also was responsible for the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers coordinating their attack on the Capitol. And it makes you wonder, how come there were so few police on hand? And where was the intelligence for this event? That's what I would be asking about. No mystery how we got to this. We did it through gerrymandering, by giving states the power to overturn elections if they want to, and they will continue to do this in 2022. We must be aware that there are many states where the Secretary of State has the power to overturn the people's vote. It's very important that we're cognizant of this and that we have a paper trail of what and who we vote for, and that this is scrutinized by 3 different parties: the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Independents. Shouldn't be left up to a one-party system to decide who won our state's elections or who won our federal elections. And that's what we've got to be careful about. And so when we vote in 2022, vote as if this was your last election and do it all the time. Because we can't have low turnout at these elections. The state level, you will find, is very important to our democracy. What happens will shape our world. We must be alert and aware that we're defending our system and the rule of law can be used against us. Some of the judges that espoused the corporate point of view, which is affecting us today, they were put there by Richard Nixon and before. And then Ronald Reagan put in Scalia onto the bench. So the courts have been leaning pro-corporation, anti-labor for quite some time. It's just taken all these years for Americans to finally notice that corporations rule. They're part of government. They're certainly part of government influence. And we, the people, have to reassert our rights. I think luckily for us, though, we know we've got to reassert our rights. And the only way I know we can do it is through the rule of law and by winning elections so that we can turn back the tide and let labor be ascendant again. This is not a left or right policy. This is a policy for people. So I know, hey, what we do, we can undo and we can do better. I know from living life that there's no end to what we can do if we put our minds to it and if we collaborate and we share our stories, because your hurt becomes my hurt. And when that happens, we can create a movement that will change the reality. So there'll be one reality and one story and one culture for all Americans, united. God bless you, and thank you for listening. See you next week, everyone, and take care. Remember, Thursdays I'm live doing education on the laws that have shaped our lives and explaining how we got here. God bless.